Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you with us again on these talks that we're putting out on our YouTube channel. We have been exploring for a number of months now the theme of biblical joy, and we're beginning to get to the end of this series. We've been covering a lot of ground. We've seen that joy is actually a central theme within the Bible and a central feature of New Testament Christianity. As the Bible describes it, it may not be the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Christianity, but it's one of the things that really stands out when we read of the New Testament community described in the Bible, in the book of Acts particularly. To be a disciple is to be marked by joy. It's a feature of who God himself is. God, we were discovering, is a being who is complete and perfect in every way. God cannot be improved upon, and therefore God is a God who enjoys eternal contentment. There's no lack of contentment, there's no sense of lack, there's no complaint within the being of God himself. And so as those called to reflect God as disciples, we're called to demonstrate this joy in every aspect of our Christian lives. It should mark our giving, we looked at that. It should mark our worship, it should mark our relationships, and we've seen how more recently a lack of joy during a time of social isolation reflects that. Well, this morning I want to look at a passage that describes what the Bible calls pure joy, or complete joy, or great joy. I wonder if that phrase rings a bell, and I wonder if you know where in the New Testament the Bible describes this pure joy. Not just joy, but an intense joy. Well, it's in James chapter 1, verse 2 to 4, and I want to read the passage. This is what James writes in those verses. Consider it a great joy, or a pure joy, as some translations say, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may become mature and complete, lacking nothing. What we discover here and elsewhere actually in the New Testament is that the Bible speaks of a great joy that is coupled with us experiencing various trials. Now that may be a foreign idea to you, as it indeed is to many of us. Surely joy and suffering don't belong together in the same couplet, the same sentence. Surely joy and suffering are mutually exclusive. Surely to experience one is by definition to be free from the other. Surely then pure joy is the result of being free from difficulties, free from any trials and painful experiences. Well, it would appear not. What the Bible describes when it uses this word joy is not the absence of pain. It's not the denial of pain or problems, but it's something that can exist alongside at times pain and problems. And once again, that's because the joy that the Bible describes is a unique kind of joy that's rooted in the gospel itself. It's not found anywhere else. It's a response to the grace of God. The gospel is the good news that Jesus has dealt with everything that keeps us disconnected from God himself. It's the good news that God has not only forgiven us, but that he has wonderfully adopted us into his family, and that now we are the targets of his grace. We're the objects of God's intense delight in Christ as a result of what Jesus has done, that he has now our best interests at heart, and he also rules and reigns over our lives and circumstances providentially. He is to us both loving and powerful. And so we as a result can enjoy the security of knowing that God is for us and that he is ruling providentially over all of our circumstances, the good stuff and the bad stuff, the heights and the depths, the sunshine and the gloom, freedom and lockdown, seasons of great prosperity and seasons of relative poverty. Now that security only comes via the gospel, because it's rooted in what Christ has done on our behalf. And the result is that we can experience not just joy, but great joy when we go through various trials. The goodness and providence of God puts all of our problems in their proper place. It gives them a context. The Christian life is not living in some kind of super spiritual denial of our pain and our problems. It's a very honest acknowledgement of the pain we experience, but it's also an invitation to apply the redemptive power of the cross to that pain in such a way that over time we find that pain transformed. Within the big story of God's goodness and sovereignty, the smaller story then of our problems runs its course in such a way that those problems and that pain ultimately will end up serving our own good and God's own glory. That's why we consider it pure joy. Grace changes everything. It doesn't mean that we're insulated from painful experiences and problems. In fact, it may well lead to us experiencing those problems as a result of us having received grace and being identified with Jesus. What it does mean, however, is that in the midst of those difficulties, you and I, in Christ, have a well that we can drink from that's way deeper than our circumstances. So what do we learn here from this little passage in James about pure joy, about being joyful in trials? First of all, that there's a choice that we need to make. James urges us here to consider something. That word elsewhere is translated count or judge or regard. It's the word that Paul uses in Philippians when he writes of Jesus himself, who did not consider equality with God, or did not count equality with God as something to be grasped onto. And so this describes something that we do internally as we reflect on and respond to the facts of our situation. It's about choosing how you think about those facts. It's about choosing the perspective that you are going to adopt, choosing the narrative that you are going to believe. The word is actually rooted in the word lead, and so this is about taking responsibility internally in the light of our trials. It's about self-leadership in difficult times. And that, of course, is the crucial issue in terms of how we will be shaped and impacted by the various trials and difficulties and painful experiences that we inevitably go through at times in life. Now, you'll know that two different people can experience the same kind of trial but end up being shaped very differently and end up developing in very different ways as a result of those trials. One can become bitter and angry and sour in spirit, but on the other hand, the other can become sensitive and softened and sweet in spirit. The determining factor that leads to how they develop as a result of experiencing that trial is the choice that they made in response to the trial, the narrative that they chose to believe, the self-leadership that they chose to exercise or failed to exercise. The perspective that they chose will determine the outcome of that experiencing. And so what it often comes down to is whether we choose to see our trials in light of God, his goodness, his wisdom, his providence, or whether we choose to see God in the light of the trials in such a way that they introduce to our minds beliefs about God that question and undermine his goodness and wisdom and providence. It's a choice, a very key life-shaping choice that we get to make when we face various trials. And the joy that we experience as disciples is the result of embracing the gospel truth about who God is and will always be, and choosing to make that the dominant narrative in our thinking. We live joyful lives when the gospel dominates our thinking and perspective, including how we understand our pain and our trials. And when our trials are seen in the light of that gospel narrative that underlines and points to the goodness and wisdom and providence of God, what we discover is that there is a joy that runs way deeper than our circumstances. I've been in church leadership long enough to see this again and again, and to understand that the happiest Christians aren't those that have had the least amount of pain in their lives. They're actually those who are most convinced of God's goodness and wisdom and providence. Whereas in actual fact, the happiest Christians are those that have not had less problems. They're often those that have had more problems, but choose to see and understand those problems in the light of God's goodness and wisdom and providence. I'm sure you can think of examples. There's some very prominent examples, aren't there, within the last 20, 30 years of the Christian world. You think of Joni Eareckson Tada, a young active girl from an athletic background who loved sports and loved outdoors activities, and then tragically at the age of 18 is paralysed from the neck down in a diving accident, and yet radiates joy. Think of Nick Vujicic, born with a rare condition, meaning that he has no arms and legs, and now a global phenomenon, a great inspiration, someone who radiates pure joy. Now those are extreme examples, but they are such good models of what the Bible speaks of here, when it speaks not just of joy, but of pure joy. I guess for you and I, it may not be that our trials are life-changing events like that, but that whatever trials we may experience, the route for us to pure joy hinges on the same internal choices that you and I need to make in the light of our difficult experiences. The kind of internal counting that we do as we form our perspective and as we arrive at conclusions about who God is in the light of our difficulties. Now, I guess that many of us perhaps are having to do a little more of that in these days. It may be that you are facing the pain of isolation and you feel a deep loneliness. It may be that you're experiencing the disappointment of plans that have had to be cancelled. It may be that you're facing a job loss. It may be that you have kids who have gone off the rails. It may be an unexpected diagnosis. It may be that you're grieving the loss of someone recently. It may be that you're just struggling with the daily grind of life in lockdown. We need, in these days, as we face various trials, to do some very careful considering so that we ensure that we arrive at the right conclusion about who God is. He is good, He is wise, He is in control. Second thing that we learn about trials here and our response to them is that they're always varied. They're varied in their type. James says when we face various trials, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some are very significant life events, others are less significant but still carry with them a measure of pain. What might be for you a trial might for me be a blessing. For some, lockdown has been a welcome relief from activity and the opportunity to reset. For others, it's been just a prison sentence. You see, we're all wired differently and we all have a range of different experiences to manage in life. Isaiah speaks of how when we pass through the fire we will not be burned, and when we pass through the water it will not swallow us up. Now those are very different experiences that threaten us in very different ways. Our trial may be the scorching heat of the fire. However, it may be the icy cold of the water. There's a variety about the things that we experience, and so it makes no sense to grade our suffering or compare our suffering with others. Trials come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They're also varied in their source. They don't come clearly labelled. That's why we should be very cautious about oversimplifying suffering, particularly the suffering of others. The disciples made that mistake on one occasion, didn't they, when they came across a man born blind from birth, and they asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? Those were the two options, and Jesus essentially turned around and said neither. If you're familiar with the book of Job, which deals with some of these big issues of suffering like no other book of the Bible, you'll know that for a period of time, this poor man who is suffering terribly in a physical and emotional way has to, on top of that, put up with listening to his so-called friends who do nothing but try and label his suffering for him by oversimplifying it. In the process, they make things far worse. Trials are varied and rarely are they clearly labelled for us. There's often a mystery about them. They may be a result of simply living in a world that's been impacted at every level by the fallout of original sin. A world that's full of thorns and thistles and viruses and genetic abnormalities and earthquakes and pandemics. And so whilst we do and can expect to enjoy a deep security in God's care for us as we look ahead to a world free from all of those consequences, the reality is we are not immune from being impacted from some of that fallout. It may be that suffering is a direct result of our own choices as we fail to live in line with God's wisdom and good plan for our lives. It may be that we drink too much and so we develop liver disease. It may be that we drive recklessly and end up in A&E. It may be, however, that suffering is a direct result of the sin of others that's unwarranted. It may be that we suffer as victims of injustice or neglect or God forbid, even abuse. It may be that suffering is a result of us identifying with Jesus. It may be persecution, it may be social isolation, it may be physical attack, or it may be the suffering that comes as a result of malevolent demonic spirits that for one reason or another are oppressing us. Suffering comes very rarely clearly labelled, and it may even be a mixture of any one of the above. Our trials are varied in their source, and so they don't come clearly labelled, and so we should be very hesitant to judge and arrive at conclusions. What doesn't vary, however, is the fact that we will all, at some time or other, and in some form or other, and for some reason or other, face trials, face difficulties. Whatever the difficulty or suffering may be, however, it does not need to define us in a negative way. Our joy, as James says, is rooted in realities far deeper than our circumstances, and Jesus has promised all of us some difficulty. Jesus said in John 16, verse 33, he said, "You will have suffering in this world." What a wonderful promise. It's not one that we put on our fridge magnets, is it? Well, the statement ends by saying, "However, be of good cheer," or "take courage, for I have conquered the world." Be of good cheer. I've conquered the world. It sounds a little bit like count it pure joy, doesn't it? Why? How can we do that? Well, because Jesus says, "I have overcome." And so, once again, we view our suffering in the light of the gospel events and their implications. We shouldn't therefore be surprised when we suffer and face painful experiences. We shouldn't be thrown off our guard in a way that suddenly we find ourselves in an emotional tailspin, questioning God and his goodness and his wisdom. 1 Peter says this, "Dear friends, do not be surprised when the fiery ordeal comes amongst you to test you, as if something unusual were happening to you. Instead, rejoice as you share in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may also rejoice with great joy when his glory is revealed." So let's not compare, let's not contrast our difficulties. They're varied. Let's not oversimplify them. They may well be impossible this side of eternity to understand. And then one final thing, and that's the outcome that the joy is rooted in. I wonder if I were to ask how many of you want to be more mature as disciples? How many want to feel more complete? How many of you want to be more secure? How many of you want to feel like you lack nothing? Well, that, according to James, is the guaranteed outcome when we respond in this way to the challenges that life throws our way by considering it pure joy when we face various trials. These experiences then, they're not an interruption to our lives as disciples. They're not an unfortunate distraction. They don't take us out of the will of God and sidetrack us from his plan and purpose. But if we respond rightly to those trials and we consider them pure joy, they become the very things that shape us in the most positive ways. They become the very things that take us into the will of God, which is ultimately, of course, that you and I become conformed to the image of Christ. So that health battle, that work situation, that relationship issue, that awful lockdown that we have to continue to endure, it's not an interruption, and it is not sidetracking you from God's good plan for your life. If you respond rightly to it, it's actually a means through which God will produce greater levels of holiness and happiness in you. That's the end goal. That's the promised outcome here. The challenge, of course, is keeping our eye on that when we are going through the mill and in the middle of the process. And it is always a process. Wherever the Bible speaks of this mysterious way in which God works through our suffering, it presents it in that way. Scripture nowhere promises overnight, instant outcomes. Faith is always coupled to patience. It's expressed in a perseverance. And so here in James, we read of the testing of our faith producing endurance, which in turn leads to completeness. Romans 5 says this: we also boast in our afflictions because we know that affliction produces endurance, and endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope. 1 Peter 1 says, you rejoice in this even though now for a short time, if necessary, you suffer grief in various trials, so that the proven character of your faith, more valuable than gold, though perishable, is refined by fire. These verses that underline the same principle as the writers urge us to respond well to trials also reflect the fact that this takes time, that it's a process. One thing leads to another, which in the end produces an outcome. And so there's a process that we're involved in, and in the middle of the process we need to keep our eye on the good outcome. We need to think more slow cooker than microwave oven. That's why the Bible speaks of learning about endurance as being essential to this process. And there's only one way that we learn to wait: by waiting. There's only one way that we learn endurance, and that's by enduring. We're having to do some of that at the moment, aren't we? The longer that these restrictions continue, the more we have to learn to wait, to endure. And that very Christ-like virtue is not very popular in our world and in our culture today. We want instant. We want instant success. We want instant results. We want kingdom now, not then. Like the prodigal son, we don't want to have to wait for an inheritance. We live in a culture that doesn't value waiting at all. We're all in a dreadful hurry at times. And yet at this time I think we're learning, amongst other things, to have to wait. We have to wait to even get into the supermarket, let alone by the time we get to the queue or the till. We have to wait a long time for things. If you have tried to drop something off at the dump in the last week or two that it's been open, you'll know that you need to be prepared to wait, possibly for several hours. I had one aborted trip to the dump where I'd even taken my Kindle to sit in the car and read, and it was just so long I didn't even bother doing that. I turned around and came home and offloaded. We're not good at waiting, are we? And we're having to learn to wait. There's a dreadful impatience in our culture today. Well, part of considering it pure joy when facing trials is learning to develop endurance, learning to see the present trial as part of a process that will, in the future, lead to a good outcome. But that outcome won't magically appear. within 24 or 48 hours. It takes time. It involves sometimes a very lengthy process. There's no next day express delivery option when it comes to the promises of God. We have to stand. And having to learn to stand, what do we need to do next? Well, we need to keep standing. Well, 8 weeks in, 9 weeks in, what do we have to do? Keep standing. We can do that with the confidence that whilst we might not enjoy instant outcomes, we will certainly one day enjoy an outcome. There will be a day when this considering it pure joy will bear fruit. If we sow to the Spirit, we will, from the Spirit, reap life. It may not be next week, it may not be in 2020, but it will happen. So let's be encouraged. Let's find grace to respond with joy to a range of challenges that we face and are facing at this time. And let's do that with a confidence that God has a good outcome in mind, that He will certainly bring to pass. Further growth, greater personal contentment, security, and to use a very overused word, well-being that's in store for us as a result of what God is doing in us through present trials of various kinds. If we can learn to consider it pure joy, here and now, in the midst of trials, then our future selves will look back one day and be glad that we learned that lesson. So to conclude, living joyfully in the light of God's goodness is not being immune to problems. It's not being immune to suffering. It's not being anathematized to the pain that life's experiences sometimes brings. It's seeing those present problems and that present pain in the light of a far bigger, far better story, the gospel story, in the light of God's goodness, His intentions towards us that are full of kindness, His wisdom and His providence. That empowers us to do what James urges us to do, to consider it pure joy whenever we face various trials, to endure with the confidence that we have in the light of the reality that God will use those experiences that we face for our good and for His great glory.